Up next, Sitting at 30 takes you downtown for the weekly luncheon meeting of the City Club of Portland. Live weekly coverage of City Club is made possible in part by TCI and is produced through the facilities of Portland Cable Access. Now we join the City Club for this week's program.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Welcome to the City Club of Portland. I'm Pete Heuser, your president. Today we're going to hear from Dick Benner, who is the director of the Oregon Department of Land Conservation and Development. Our program today is sponsored by Washington Mutual Savings Bank, Kaiser Permanente, and the law firm of Miller, Nash, Weiner, Hager, and Carlson. We continue to be very grateful for their support. Next Friday, we're going to have a panel discussion dealing with legislation that's underway in charter schools. So we've got a stellar panel: Secretary of State Phil Kiesling, State Senator Tom Hartung, and Governor Kitzhaber's Education Advisor Gene Thorne. That will be here at the Multnomah Club. I want to welcome today, we have leaders of Portland's neighborhood associations. Would you please stand? We see you here today. There we go. Okay, welcome to the City Club. You'll want to consider joining us formally. Our board host today is Don Williams. Don is business manager with the Schwabe, Williamson, and Wyatt law firm. He'll ask the first question of our speaker, and then, as usual, we'll take questions from City Club members in the audience. As you know, the club is very active in growth issues, particularly with our Growth Management and Environment Issue Committee. So we're very pleased to have with us today Dick Benner. He's been the director of the Oregon Department of Land Conservation and Development since 1991. Prior to that, he was a staff attorney for 12 years with Thousand Friends of Oregon. He was also the first executive director of the Columbia River Gorge Commission. He directed the Commission's preparation and adoption of a management plan for the Columbia River Gorge National Scenic Area. So he's been as active as anyone in growth planning here in the state. We have him to thank for protecting us from the unfettered growth that might otherwise occur. Now, in his free time, I understand that he's a whitewater rafter, so he gets out there in the land that he's charged with protecting. Now, in Mr. Benner's role as director, he works with cities, counties, state agencies to administer the state land use planning programs. Also, he has some authority over Metro, particularly as it relates to the urban growth boundary, just to make sure that it is in accordance with state planning goals. Now, Dick Benner's job is not an easy one. We all feel good about Oregon's economy growing with new jobs, perhaps additional taxes to run state programs, but with that, we have to balance environmental and wildlife protection, affordable housing, transportation, and so many other issues. So let's welcome Dick Benner to hear what he has to say about what his department has been doing in the past and what they plan to do in the future to deal with these competing issues.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, City Club, for the opportunity to speak, and thank you for the respite from the fray in Salem. If you read the Oregonian, or otherwise are media advantaged, you know that Oregon's statewide land use planning program is under attack in Salem. Monday, the Senate passed a bill, Senate Bill 454, that would eliminate the only test for new farm dwellings that has actually worked to prevent the suburbanization of the state's most important farmland. Tuesday, this week, a Senate committee passed a realtors bill, Senate Bill 1187, that will unleash urban sprawl outside urban growth boundaries and deprive Oregon of the benefits for which we created urban growth boundaries in the first place. The land use program was controversial in 1973 when it was established, and it's been under a microscope every legislative session since then. There's nothing wrong with putting the land use program under a microscope. In fact, I think it has made improvements in the program over the years, and it keeps it flexible and responsive to changing needs over the past 25 or 26 years. But there is a new attack underway, a new argument being leveled against the program. This time, critics are charging that the program has failed to protect prime farmland and has failed to stop sprawl. It is this charge that I want to address today, and I'm going to disregard an Abraham Lincoln aphorism that the hen is the wisest animal of all. She only cackles once the egg is laid. I'm going to cackle even though we are still laying the egg. 26 years ago, with the enactment of Senate Bill 100 and Senate Bill 101, Oregon made a deliberate choice to stop sprawling across farmland and to contain urban sprawl. Cities and counties established urban growth boundaries around 240 cities. Counties applied farm and forest zoning to 26 million acres across the state. Should we ask ourselves, where are we going and what's with this handbasket? What good has all of this done us? Well, here's my answer. I'm going to start with farmland and then get to sprawl. I'm going to give you some farmland numbers, but first I want to give you 3 successes that you can see with your own eyes, all within an hour's drive of this facility. The Red Hills of Dundee. The vineyards on those hills are today the heart of Oregon's 7,800-acre, $45 million wine industry. 30 years ago, Yamhill County designated all of that land for acreage home sites. Because of the statewide planning program, the county had to rezone those lands for farm use. Next time you drive through the wine country or sip a glass of Oregon Pinot Noir, thank Oregon's land use planning program. Closer to home, Sauvie Island. In 1975, there was a proposal before Multnomah County to divide 4,000 acres on Sauvie Island, 4,000 acres of prime farmland into 5-acre parcels. The county denied the subdivisions because they would have violated the brand new agricultural lands goal number 3. 24 years later, there is virtually the same amount of land in crops on Sauvie Island as the day the county said no to those subdivisions. Next time you buy a pumpkin at the pumpkin patch, offer a thank you to Oregon's statewide planning program. Hood River Valley, one of Oregon's most beautiful and productive little valleys. Upper Valley orchardists relied upon the statewide planning program to stop a 400-acre destination resort at the edge of the orchards. They had to do it twice, once in 1978 and again in 1982. Today, notwithstanding the very great attractiveness of that valley and the windsurfing boom that brought new money and new people to that valley, there are more acres in apples and pears today than there were in 1982. In fact, they've increased by 10%. Next time you take out-of-state friends on the Mount Hood Railroad to see the blossoms, say thank you to Goal 3, as the Upper Valley orchardists do regularly. Here's a comparison that I find interesting. Between 1978 and 1992, 14 years, all years when the statewide planning program was in effect, Washington County absorbed 40,000 more people than Clark County over the same number of years. Yet Clark County, not subject to a statewide planning program during those years, lost 6,000 acres more farmland than did Washington County. Per farm income dropped 10% in Clark County over that period. It rose in Washington County by 36%. Sprawling growth is delivering a body blow to agriculture in Clark County. Thanks to the statewide planning program, Washington County's agriculture is prospering. All those former Portlanders who moved to Clark County to avoid our income tax are going to have to move back for food, I guess. Today, there are 2 million acres in farm zones in the Willamette Valley. To get there, state law required valley counties to rezone more than 300,000 of those acres, including the Red Hills of Dundee, from acreage home sites to farm zones. Counties were also required to strengthen their farm zones on all 2 million acres. Today, 6 of Oregon's top 10 agricultural counties, measured by farm income, are Willamette Valley counties. And that includes Washington County and Clackamas County, even though they are in the shadow of the state's largest metropolitan area, home to 45% of the state's population. The best overall picture of agriculture in the Valley comes from the latest Census of Agriculture, 1997. It's published by the U.S. Department of Commerce. According to the census, land and farms in the Valley increased, not decreased, from 1992 to 1997. The census is done every 5 years. It increased by 2.6%. The number of acres was 1,711,000 in 1992. By 1997, the number was 1,757,000 acres. That's an increase of 45,500 acres. The number of acres of cropland increased by 4% to 1.2 million acres. Now, I don't want these numbers to leave an erroneous impression. We are not plowing subdivisions and shopping malls into crops. Part of this, perhaps all of it, is a quirk of how the census is being done. And we think perhaps the explanation is that Christmas tree farms, which weren't previously counted in the base, are now counted in the base. Nonetheless, I think the census tells us that the Willamette Valley farmland is holding its own today. Are we losing any farmland in the Valley? Yes, we are losing some ground. What we are losing is the farmland inside urban growth boundaries that our cities established 15 to 20 years ago. But we weren't trying to save this land. This is the land we deliberately set aside to diversify Oregon's economy, generate jobs for our people, and provide housing for our children. Critics point to this land loss and say the land use program is failing. But let's be fair to the land use program and ask a different question. Are we losing the farmland we are trying to protect? Let me give you some farmland loss numbers for the Valley. In fact, I'm going to give you a little test. This is an embarrassment-free test. Here's the question. How many acres of the farmland that were zoned for farm use in 1987 in the Valley have we lost since that date? That's 12 years. We lose farmland in two ways. Cities expand their urban growth boundaries over time, sometimes onto farmland, and counties designate farmland for rural development, usually rural residential development. Before you pick your numbers, I want to give you a few hints. Starting with urban growth boundaries. Clue number one, there are 438,000 acres in the urban growth boundaries of the 91 Valley cities today. Metro is responsible for about half of that. Clue number two, urban growth boundaries are drawn to include a 20-year supply of land. Clue number three, 15 to 20 years has passed since LCDC approved the urban growth boundaries. Metro's urban growth boundary is 20 years old this year. Clue number four, there are 420,000 more people living in the Valley today, that's about 3 Eugenes, than when the last boundary was established. Here's a clue about land rezoned from farmland to rural development uses. It's very difficult to do under state law. So write the numbers on your napkin or your hand or wherever you might want to write them. The first number should represent your guess at the number of acres added to the urban growth boundaries of the 91 Valley cities over the last 12 years. The second number should be your guess at the number of acres taken from farm zones and put into rural residential zones in the Valley since 1987. Any of you whose combined number is anywhere close to mine can pick up as your prize a bookmark of the Transportation and Growth Management Program on the table over to my right. Here are the answers, which come from reports that are produced by counties and sent into the state annually. The total number of acres that have been added to the urban growth boundaries of the 91 Valley cities over the past 12 years is 2,671 acres. The total number of acres that have been rezoned from farm zones to rural development zones since 1987 is 1,429 acres. So the combined total, farmland added to urban growth boundaries plus farmland going into rural zones, over the past 12 years is 4,070 acres. I don't know how that number strikes you, but to me, it's an indicator of a remarkable achievement. That 4,070 acres is 2/100ths of 1% of the 2 million acres in farm zones in the valley. In contrast, the Central Valley of California is losing 15,000 acres a year of farmland. I wish we hadn't lost the 4,000 acres over these past 4 years, but the number tells me that the land base for commercial agriculture in the Willamette Valley is secure for the present. What about the future? Is valley farmland threatened by coming expansions of urban growth boundaries, of growing valley cities? Are the cities along the I-5 corridor going to sprawl together into one giant conurbation? That is in fact what is being said in Salem. The critics of the program believe all these cities are going to merge together. So let me talk about sprawl for a few minutes. Again, before I give you numbers, let me tell you 3 short stories about sprawl busting that took place near here. In 1975, just after LCDC adopted the statewide planning goals, an application to build a 27-acre shopping center on Highway 26 across from what I used to know as Heidi's Swiss Village landed on a planner's desk in Clackamas County. The county eagerly approved the shopping center, but the city of Sandy appealed it because the site was rural and it was outside, far outside, Sandy. The city won at the Court of Appeals, which ruled that the shopping center violated the new urbanization goal. Today, there is no shopping center out there on Highway 26 amid the caneberries and nursery stock. Instead, there is a new shopping center in the city limits of Sandy. Next time you drive to Mount Hood, finally accelerating upon your departure from Gresham, and you don't have to stop at the light at Boring, thank the statewide planning program. Second example, in the early 90s, school officials in the town of Silverton, which is in Marion County, began a search for a new school site. They needed a high school site. They had difficulty finding an affordable site in town, so they found a site on farmland outside Silverton's urban growth boundary. Marion County, which does an excellent job of protecting its farmland base, told them that state law did not allow the siting of schools on high-value farmland outside urban growth boundaries. After a bit of wrangling, including an unsuccessful effort to change the law in the legislature, school officials found a site downtown. Silverton will not be spilling out onto Marion County farmland, but also important, the in-town site is more accessible to kids on foot and by bike. The school board and the state will save money on busing. Third example, 5 years ago, the small city of North Plains, a short distance west of the metro area on Highway 26, decided to add 306 acres to its urban growth boundary, nearly doubling it. This land is prime farmland and would have incorporated the Dersham Road interchange on Highway 26. The city's intention was to develop highway-oriented commercial uses at the interchange. The Oregon Department of Transportation appealed that decision to the Land Use Board of Appeals on grounds that it would have a heavy impact on Highway 26. My department, the Department of Land Conservation and Development, also opposed the urban growth boundary expansion because it included farmland that wasn't shown to be needed for urban development. On appeal, the Land Use Board of Appeals held that the expansion violated the statewide planning goals. Our department is now working with the city to find an alternative for them. Next time you're on your way to the North Coast, thank the statewide planning program for that uncongested stretch of Highway 26. Enjoy the open landscape of working farms in the area, and don't forget to buy Oregon farm products. To get a sense for the benefit we gain by stopping sprawl, let's compare the amount of land that would probably urbanize in the Portland metropolitan area if we did not have a planning program, with the much smaller amount of land we will urbanize because we do have a planning program. We expect to accommodate 720,000 new people over the next 40 years in the metropolitan area. How much land do we need to house and employ 720,000 people? Well, it depends on how we plan our communities. When Metro began its 2040 planning effort in 1992, it developed what it called the base case. The base case is the amount of land that would have to be urbanized to accommodate 720,000 people if no effort were made to comply with regional and statewide planning goals. The base case said it would have to add 121,000 acres to the existing urban growth boundary. That would be more than a 50% expansion of the boundary. The Portland base case is the way most American cities grow. Kansas City, Minneapolis, St. Paul, they expect the same amount of people coming to their areas over the next 40 years. Kansas City says it's going to need 130,000 acres. Minneapolis, St. Paul says it needs 100,000 acres to accommodate the same number of people as we're going to get. The base case would have violated the statewide planning goals, but that's not why Metro rejected it. People in this region looked at the base case and they rejected it. They rejected it because it showed Gresham and Sandy growing together, Wilsonville, Tualatin, and West Lynn growing together, North Plains, Forest Grove, Cornelius, all joining in an amorphous megalopolis that reached far onto high-quality farmland. Instead, Metro and the 24 cities and 3 counties that make up the region developed the 2040 growth concept. The growth concept uses land efficiently. It can accommodate the expected 720,000 people over the next 40 years on 35,800 vacant acres, infill redevelopment of developed land. That 35,800 acres is composed of 17,200 acres of buildable land inside the boundary and 18,600 acres to be added to the boundary over time. Now, here are some of the implications of Metro's choice. Again, looking at farmland first. The base case would add 121,000 acres to the urban growth boundary over the next 40 years. The 2040 growth concept will add only 18,600. You subtract one from the other, the difference between the base case and the growth concept is 102,000 acres. That is, the growth concept will absorb 102,000 acres less than would the base case. Assume 3/4 of that difference would be farmland. With that assumption, the growth concept will save 76,650 acres of farmland. An acre of farmland in the metropolitan area, the 3 counties, generates an average of $1,460 a year in farm income. The saved farmland will generate $112 million annually for the metropolitan economy, not counting processing. The saved farmland will employ 3,292 farm workers and support 477 jobs in the agricultural processing industry. That income and those jobs would be lost if we built the base case. This is not a trade-off. This is not a trade-off between 3,769 farm-related jobs and some large number of high-tech jobs. If we build the 2040 growth concept, we will have room for both, including greater employment diversity, which is critically important in our downtimes. We will also have more open space, less flooding, faster trips to the coast and the mountains, cleaner air, cleaner water, and cheaper public services, which I will embellish in a moment. This is the farmland we will save if we stick to our vision in the metro area. But Oregon's is a statewide planning program. We will save much more than 76,650 acres if we continue to follow the land use program in other parts of the state. And there is evidence that other urban areas are also holding the line against sprawl. Now, the numbers I'm going to give you here are 20-year numbers, so they're going to be different from the metro numbers I was just talking about, which are 40-year numbers. So I'll try to go through the numbers slowly so you can catch them. In the next 20 years, neither Salem-Keizer, nor Corvallis, nor Albany, nor Eugene-Springfield, the largest cities after Portland, needs more than about 100 acres to accommodate the next 20 years' worth of growth. In fact, our survey indicates that all 91 cities in the valley will need to add less than 15,000 acres to their urban growth boundaries to absorb 20 years' worth of growth. That includes the 11,000 or so that Metro expects to add for its 20-year supply. And again, that's different from the 40-year supply. Only a portion of this land, this 15,000 acres, will be farmland. That's because outside urban growth boundaries of most cities, there is still rural residential land that has capacity for urban expansion. If the portion of the 15,000 acres that would come into growth boundaries, if the portion of that, which is farmland, is 5,000 acres over the next 20 years, that's less than 3/100ths of 1% of the 2 million acres of farmland in the Willamette Valley. That's a pretty effective farmland protection program. That's a pretty effective urban containment program. Now let's consider the cost of providing public services. Metro Executive was here a couple of months ago, Mike Burton was here a couple of months ago, telling us that the region doesn't have enough money to build the urban infrastructure we need for the next 40 years. The situation calls to mind a statement by a British statesman during World War II, quote, "Gentlemen, we are out of money, therefore we shall have to think," unquote. We are short of infrastructure money, therefore we shall have to think about infrastructure. So let's see if I can stimulate your thinking. There are about 500 studies that have been published about the cost of providing services to different development patterns since the famous cost of sprawl study that was done by the Real Estate Research Corporation in 1974. The great majority of those studies conclude that it costs considerably less to provide linear services, sewer, water, streets, to an efficient development pattern than to a sprawling development pattern. How much less is going to depend upon the variables in a particular community. But the basic inverse relationship is well established. It's less expensive to serve an efficient pattern than a sprawling pattern. Let me draw your attention to two of the studies. The first was done in 1992 by Rutgers University for the New Jersey legislature. That study compared the cost of good old-fashioned New Jersey sprawl with a more compact form of development, which is now favored by Governor Christie Todd Whitman for good reason, as optional ways to accommodate the 520,000 new residents New Jersey was looking at over 20 years. Rutgers, that highly regarded alma mater of Mr. Magoo, found that the more compact development pattern would save $1.3 billion in public facility capital construction costs and $400 million annually in operation and maintenance costs. The second study corroborated that conclusion. It's called, quote, "Alternatives for Future Urban Growth in California's Central Valley, the Bottom Line." This was done in 1975, and it was done by the American Farmland Trust. The Central Valley, which today is home to 4 million people, is expected to add 8 million people by the year 2040. So they had good reason to be concerned about this. The study compared the consequences of growth in the valley in two different development patterns. 3 dwelling units per acre, that's California today, and 6 units per acre. The study concluded that cities and counties in the valley would save $29 billion in the cost of taxpayer-financed services over the 45-year period covered by the study if growth happened at 6 units per acre rather than 3 units per acre. In fact, the study showed that each new resident coming to the valley would cost local governments $123 more in the cost of services than he or she would contribute in taxes if growth occurred in the sprawling 3 units per acre pattern. But each new resident would contribute $27 a year more in taxes than he or she would cost in services if the growth occurred at 6 units per acre. These studies should cause us to think, as urged by that British statesman. Here are my thoughts. If infrastructure funds are severely limited and we can save millions of dollars by abandoning sprawl, we should abandon sprawl. Let me put it another way. If infrastructure funds are limited, we shouldn't use them to subsidize sprawl. And finally, one more way. If we had enough infrastructure money to serve a sprawl pattern over the next 40 years, but we could save hundreds of millions of dollars by growing efficiently, we should grow efficiently and put the savings into schools. The statewide planning program has been containing sprawl and moving us toward a more efficient form for 25 years. While other states have been studying how much infrastructure they might save if they were to grow efficiently, we have been growing more efficiently. Here's an example. Metro. Metro learned to its surprise a couple of years ago that a quarter of all new residential development and 40% of new jobs in the metro area in the recent past have occurred on land it considered to be already developed. Metro calls this refill development. We can see this development around us, the Belmont Dairy development over in southeast Portland, commercial and residential development in the Lloyd District, Tualatin Commons, some of the light rail station areas. If this development had gone out onto rural lands with little or no urban infrastructure, costs, both public and private, would have been much higher. Back to the base case and the 2040 growth concept. Recall that the base case would spread onto 102,000 acres more than the growth concept. Sewer lines, storm drains, water lines, streets and roads, school buses would all have to serve an additional 102,000 acres. We need an analysis like that done in New Jersey or California to estimate really what the precise savings will be. And we don't tend to do things like that in Oregon because those studies cost too much. And we must account for the additional cost of building on difficult sites as we try to protect farmland. Nonetheless, serving 102,000 fewer acres with these linear services is certain, in my mind, to save us much in capital and operation and maintenance infrastructure costs. One more point about infrastructure costs that derive from the statewide planning program. Recall the Silverton High School example of a couple of minutes ago. Remember, the school board was ready to site the high school on farmland outside its urban growth boundary. The reason, of course, is that farmland outside the boundary is less expensive. But is the site really less expensive if all costs are considered? Taxpayers spend over $100 million a year on school busing. That's $470 a year for each student bused. If school boards were fully accountable for busing costs, I imagine they would consider accessibility to their students when siting new schools and weigh the cost of busing over time measured against the one-time savings from a less expensive remote site. But Measure 5 in 1990 shifted most of the cost of busing, 70% now, to the state. The state has nothing to do with choosing school sites. School boards naturally give greater weight to land cost. In the Silverton case, however, the statewide planning program prevented the remote siting of the school and saved taxpayers some busing costs. Of course, there is much more to be gained from growth management strategy in the Oregon planning program than farmland and infrastructure dollars. Recent studies about water quality in watersheds, in the Chesapeake Bay watershed, for example, indicate that efficient development patterns, if well designed, and that's an important caveat, have less impact on water quality than sprawling patterns do. Just after the February '96 floods, Chuck Steele of the Federal Emergency Management Authority was in Oregon to supervise their activities after the flood. He said that Oregon's land use planning program had saved the state millions of dollars in avoided flood damage as compared with the state of Washington, for example, by confining urban development within urban growth boundaries. Some of the benefits are less tangible. By containing urban development within urban growth boundaries, we focus investment within instead of sprawling out. That does a lot to save our downtowns, and in turn our civility and our sense of place. We are saving the working landscape of farms and woodlots across the state. Drive Highway 99 between McMinnville and Junction City sometime and appreciate that. Saving these places of the heart has incalculable spiritual value that we appreciate only when we begin to lose it. By now you've probably gathered that I'm a fan of the Oregon Planning Program. I am, but I am not blind to its weaknesses. The legislature and the Land Conservation and Development Commission devote much energy every year to fixing the flaws in the program that serve us from time to time, and there are. But there are two weaknesses that haven't gotten much attention. First, the land use program has been very effective saying no to development in the wrong places, on farmland, for example. But it is less effective getting to yes on development in the right places, development that can enhance our communities. Second, the land use program has proven effective containing urban sprawl and protecting farmland, but it has not done as well protecting Oregon's special places. The Oregon program stopped sprawl in the Columbia River Gorge, but it took an act of Congress, the Columbia River Gorge National Scenic Area Act, to protect that magnificent landscape. So I want to conclude with a plug for two additions to the planning program to address both of these. First, how to get to yes on development that strengthens our communities. There are, of course, many things that can be done, some of which are being done. I want to highlight one important one: build infrastructure in the right places. Former Governor Goldschmidt was quoted recently saying, "Capital, not regulation, is the key to influencing investment behavior." Development often follows the trail of infrastructure. The interstate highway system is proof enough of that. In politics, we say, follow the money. In land use, it's follow the roads and sewers. If you wonder why Metro began to sprawl, the Metro region began to sprawl onto Washington County farmland 15 years ago, follow the extension of the sewer line some 25 years ago to the Rock Creek campus of Portland Community College on Highway 26, at that time far away from any urban center, and observe the influence it had on the drawing of the metropolitan urban growth boundary in 1978. Let's stop building sprawl unwittingly with our infrastructure. Let's put those dollars to work for community attributes we want: accessibility, safety, clean air, clean water, transportation choices, and housing affordability. We need an investment strategy that says yes to development of a brownfield site and no to a sewer line outside an urban growth boundary. Oregon is developing such an investment strategy. It began with an executive order a couple of years ago that said to state agencies, when you look for new offices, look to downtowns, look to centers, look to areas served by transit. The Oregon Department of Transportation led the way by relocating its Region 1 headquarters here to downtown Portland along light rail. A second executive order in 1997 directed to the 5 agencies of what the governor calls his community solutions team: economic development, transportation, environmental quality, housing, and land conservation and development, and told them to ensure that their investments reinforce the state's growth management objectives. In line with that direction, the Oregon Transportation Commission last month revised its guidelines for the Immediate Opportunity Fund, some of you may know about that, to allow a good portion of it to be used for transportation projects that reinforce downtowns and other centers of development. The governor's 21st Century Fund, you've probably heard him talk about that, would make state funds available for affordable housing, local street networks, rebuilding main streets, and other community building projects. We need to formalize these efforts, make them part of the way we do business, and we need to bring local governments and federal agencies particularly into the mix, part of a strategy, so state, federal, and local infrastructure dollars work together. And we've got to find money for our infrastructure. Good ideas for infrastructure funding have been on the table for some time. Just recently, the governor's task force on growth called for taxing the large increment of value that accrues to a property designated to come into the urban growth boundary. I've heard industry representatives say that they would support a real estate transfer tax if the proceeds were dedicated to infrastructure and affordable housing. What's missing is regional consensus about what infrastructure to build. Some believe we should build no new infrastructure because they think it induces growth, and of course it can, if it's in the wrong places. Others believe we should add capacity everywhere, such as the nearly defunct West Side bypass. This region found a consensus about which parks and which open space to build after an unsuccessful bond measure, and the new effort was approved by voters with industry support because there was a consensus about what to build, what to buy. There's a lesson here. Local governments in the region must be able to show their constituents that they would be what they would be buying with their infrastructure dollars. If we can find consensus about which roads to build, which transit lines, which sewer lines, and so on, then we will find it easier to agree on how to pay for it. Second, how do we protect some of our most magnificent landscapes? Regulation has its limits, political and legal. We can't tell a landowner to keep something pretty for the rest of us if we leave him or her without a reasonable economic use of his or her land. What can we do about the old subdivisions of small, highly visible lots along the Oregon coast that are outside urban growth boundaries, beyond services, platted before the statewide planning program? Well, one answer is unfolding in Deschutes County, the area south of Sun River. Developers platted over 13,000 small lots along the Deschutes and Little Deschutes rivers in the 60s and 70s. Half are now settled. Homes rely on wells and septic tanks, even though in many areas groundwater is 2 feet below the surface. A water quality disaster looms there. Build out of all of those 13,000 lots would also block the most important deer migration route in Oregon. Deschutes County is developing Oregon's first significant transfer of development rights program. TDR, it's called. Owners of these lots posing a high risk of water pollution receive development credits, which they can transfer to building lots in a new village the county is planning along an existing sewer line between Lapine and Wickiup Junction. Oregon needs a mechanism to take advantage of innovative ideas like TDR. It needs a state-chartered conservancy that can acquire a scenic easement to save a landscape from discordant development, to provide access to the beach, to purchase platted land, replat it, reduce the impact of development and resell the lots, and to act as a bank for a TDR program, such as Deschutes County's. None of these ideas involves regulations. All of these ideas keep private land on tax rolls. A state conservancy can empower smaller, wholly private conservancies to extend their capabilities. A state conservancy can be more supple than a regulation, quicker and more creative than most bureaucracies, more powerful than a locomotive, able to, anyway, more successful protecting our most important landscapes. Oregon is the closest thing America has to a deliberate place. We may disagree about the merits of growth, but we have been very deliberate about how we grow, if grow we must. For choosing this course, Oregon is seen as exceptional all across the country. Every year we stand by our land use program, the benefits accrue. Let's hold on to our vision tenaciously. Don't keep your thoughts and aspirations for Oregon to yourselves. Talk about them with your legislators, and do it now. While legislators are encamped in Salem, while they are changing laws and adopting budgets that will affect the quality of life in this region. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. 20 years ago, I met my future wife at a planning commission meeting in Oregon City. She was hired under an LCDC grant, and I've been a fan of your agency ever since. Many of us interested in planning issues are extremely concerned about the lack of integration between land use planning and transportation. In fact, some, including our own Ray Polani, have concluded that unless it's corrected, both systems will fail. Can you elaborate on this?
It's a connection that we should have made many, many years ago, that is between land use and transportation. If you have any doubt about the effect of transportation decisions on land use, on farmland protection, on development patterns, all you have to think about is the interstate highway system and what that has done. I would say folks in Salem, myself included, woke up to the connection perhaps 6 or 7 years ago, at least woke up to it in a practical way, and began to make the connection. It was the birth of the Transportation and Growth Management Program that brings my department, Land Conservation and Development, together with the Oregon Department of Transportation. We actually share budgets, share employees, engineers talking to planners, and the notion is if we make good land use decisions, we can save the value of our transportation investments, access management, for example. If we make good transportation decisions, we can save the livability of our communities. So we don't send a bypass far outside the urban growth boundaries, sprawling around from one end of the region to another, when that really doesn't do anything for our congestion problems. If we can get these two things together, make that connection, we can benefit greatly. So in the last 6 years, the joint ODOT and DLCD Transportation and Growth Management Program has been spending federal transportation dollars, newly made flexible in 1991 by Congress so that it could be used on things besides asphalt. And we've been using that to help communities plan a different way of growing, plan so that they make transportation and land use decisions together. It's a small program, but it's been very effective so far. What we need to do, of course, is to do more of it and do it faster. It's a critical connection. When I am before budget committees in Salem and a skeptical legislator wants to know why we're spending some millions of dollars on planning instead of filling potholes, what I say is, Senator or Representative Jones or Smith, if we had been thinking about this connection 25 years ago, we wouldn't have had to pay $100 million to do a second bypass in Bend. If we can do good planning now, transportation and land use together, in our 240 cities, and if the effect of that is to avoid or postpone just one bypass, we've probably saved $2 for every one we spent on planning. And of course, it'll do much more than that over the years. So it's a critical connection.
Matteo Luccio, City Club member. Good afternoon, Dick. In an article you wrote from a magazine, Oregon's Future, a while back, you discussed affordable housing and that link. And you advocated, quote, new strategy, unquote. You said, which must look to community design and to compact mixed-use, pedestrian-friendly development patterns as the context within which the marketplace can operate. Can you talk a little bit about what LCDC and right now the legislature is doing as far as the connection with between land use planning and affordable housing?
Yes. The point that I was trying to make there is the assessment of the affordable housing program, in my estimation, has been too narrow. The discussion has been too narrow. It looks at the cost of the house, the cost of the land, and it's been going up in the metro area very rapidly, and not just here. What I've been suggesting is that we look at the affordability of the community, not just the affordability of the housing. If we are successful in growing more efficiently, we can save money that can be applied to housing. Let me give you an example. The data is pretty clear that a more efficient land development pattern is also a more efficient transportation pattern. Destinations are more accessible. We can take trips. We can maybe take more than one trip by car, combining destinations, or we don't have to use the car at all. We can go on foot. We can go by bike. If we're good enough at that, and it's not that hard to be good enough, a household that maybe has 2 cars could give up one of the cars. According to the American Automobile Association, it costs about $6,000 a year to own and operate a late model car. Well, let's suppose you can give up one of those cars. You save $6,000. Divide that by 12 monthly mortgage payments, and you can afford a little bit more house if you don't have to have 2 cars. Referring back to the American Farmland Trust study of the Central Valley, what they found is if you grow in an inefficient pattern, every new residence is going to cost those local governments a lot more in services. If you grow in a more efficient pattern, we can save money. In fact, there's even a net gain. Well, let's suppose we do that. We spend less on infrastructure. We can devote that saved money to other kinds of amenities that draw people into town. And you could even apply some of those dollar savings to reduce the cost of infrastructure, make urban living a little less expensive, and people can afford to spend a little more on housing. So it's important to look at the design of the community, not just the cost of an individual unit of housing.
Thank you.
Chip Greening, City Club member. I hope you can clear up a mystery for me. You've said that the land use program is under attack in Salem at the moment, and we all know that there are many legislators who are unalterably opposed to land use planning, have been for many years, and yet there are some legislators, otherwise moderate, who are jumping on the bandwagon to oppose land use planning. An example is my own senator, Tom Hartung, who is the speaker next week, by the way. He has jumped on the attack against the land use program, and I can't understand why these legislators, otherwise moderate, now are on this attack. Can you explain it?
I wish I could, Chip. I'll offer you a part explanation. You know, the polls taken statewide or regional about support for the land use planning program indicate that support has grown. It's very solid now, and it has been for a number of years. In fact, the last time I saw a poll indicating that support was weak was 1982, when there was an initiative to tube the program, and that's when the state was in recession. But since then, polling indicates there's solid support for the planning program today. My explanation is that people feel strongly about land use planning, but they feel more strongly about other things. So when they go to the ballot box, they're thinking about safety, they're thinking about taxes, they're thinking about reducing the size of government, they're thinking about crime, thinking about schools, and they don't think about how the candidate might be on land use. Even as important as it is to people, they tend not to cast their ballots on that ground. Consequently, an awful lot of the people who come to Salem and have been coming to Salem for some years are coming in on a platform of reducing the size of government, cutting the cost of government, and otherwise. And land use simply hasn't been high enough on the agenda. And I spend a great deal of my time and have 6 months every other year for the last couple of sessions dealing with someone who comes to Salem whose only exposure to land use is a complaint that he or she got from a constituent who wasn't able to build on farmland. And that is this legislator's view of the land use program. They weren't here 20 years ago when it was done. They don't understand why it was drawn. So they have a very ill-conceived notion of what the program's about. And I do find that after 6 months of serving on committees, these legislators hear from advocates of planning, they hear from farmers. It always surprises them when they hear from farmers that they want the land use program. They want to protect farmland, whereas in other places, you know, everybody wants, the farmers want to divide their land. Well, that isn't the way it is here. It surprises legislators, so by the end of 6 months, they go home at least with a slightly altered view. And maybe when they come back, it'll be different next time, but that's about as good as I can do in explaining that.
John Leeper, City Club member. Sir, the Federal Endangered Species Act, with one of its attendant consequences is the widening of riparian corridors, I would think is going to have an impact on the state land use. And I wondered if your agency and you have any assessment of that and what your perspective on the Endangered Species Act and its impact either is or will be.
Yes, it certainly will have an impact on the statewide planning program, development patterns, City of Portland, the region, in fact, every place that is a habitat for one of the endangered species. My agency is part of the Governor's Salmon Plan. The two things that my department is supposed to work on with local governments is improving protection of riparian corridors and working on the problem of urban runoff. I mentioned during my remarks that there are studies coming out that indicate that it is better to grow in an efficient land use pattern, even though that seems to mean more development in a given unit of land, let's say, than to sprawl. And the reason I think is fairly obvious. If you sprawl, you end up covering more ground with asphalt, with impervious surfaces, etc. But one of the important things that comes out of those studies saying that we do better if we grow more efficiently is that's only true if we design our more efficient development properly. And what they're talking about is making sure that riparian areas are kept largely free of development. They're talking about simple development techniques, not sending all of the liquid that falls on our homes and our parking lots into the storm drain, but instead trying to dispose of them on site, storing them on site, releasing them at different times. All of this is going to make things a little more difficult. Regardless of the development pattern we choose, it's going to be more difficult, and we're going to have to pay more attention to part of our infrastructure, which is the green infrastructure. We're going to have to make sure that we're providing adequate urban open space and protect riparian areas. But I think you're absolutely right. We're going to have to pay more attention to how we develop in an efficient pattern.
Ray Polani, a City Club member. I think you mentioned before the accusation that land use planning has failed to stop sprawl. Well, in some ways, we've added, I think you said 2,671 acres to the UGB, and plan to add another 18,600 over time. 2040 plans to add 1,200 miles of additional pavement. I think it's true, we obviously could have done better. I think the bottom line, however, is money, and you touched on that too. My question is, are you ready to push for shifting money to the transit alternative, which is what is needed very much? Are you prepared? Maybe I should ask, are we prepared all together?
Yes, better question. I mentioned the state investment strategy. The Community Solutions Team, which works with the Governor's Office on developing an investment strategy, making sure that state investments are investments for the right kind of development in communities and not urban sprawl. I've been working at that since for about 6 years, so I am prepared and have been doing it. What I find, though, is it is mostly an educational effort. The people I work with on a daily basis in state government, they understand this, they're ready to do it, but they need a political setting which makes it possible to do it. And we don't have that setting in Salem. It's very difficult for a lot of people down there to grasp the connection between land use and transportation. It just seems so obvious that if we have congestion, why can't we, for heaven's sakes, let's put the money into more roads, because then we can get where we're going faster. And of course, if you take a look at history, that doesn't work. I saw a piece recently in the paper about Atlanta. We used to complain about LA. Now it's Atlanta. Atlanta is the sprawliest place in Western civilization. At least that's what we're told. And the article was about a decision by Hewlett-Packard, which already has a big office tower in Atlanta. It's decided not to build the second one because it knows its employees are going to face a hell of commuting. This is a city that has paid no attention to development patterns. It's got ring roads all over the place and only intends to build more, evidently. Getting back to your question, yes, I am prepared to work on it.